My name is Charlotte Quinn. I'm 32 years old. I serve as a commissioned officer in the United States Air Force, with a specialization in strategic linguistics and cultural intelligence. Most of my work happens behind glass walls and under fluorescent lights, decoding conversations that weren't meant to be understood. I've translated threats, promises, military posturing, and peace offerings in half a dozen dialects. But no assignment ever prepared me for what happened the night my father told me to stand in the corner. The diplomatic dinner was supposed to be symbolic, half strategy, half ceremony. The Pentagon had sent our Pacific Command delegation to host the Chinese military attachés at Yokota Air Base. Brass from both sides, fancy uniforms, polished shoes, wine glasses tall and thin. The kind of place where people smiled with only their mouths. My father, Lieutenant General Brock Quinn, was the face of the American table. 3 stars on his shoulders, steel in his posture, and a voice that could slice through a hanger. He was the reason I was even there, technically. I'd been assigned as a language support officer. But make no mistake, I wasn't invited. I was brought along the way you'd bring a spare tire. You're here in case the tech fails, he said that morning. Otherwise, keep to the wall. We don't need a lecture on tonal variations of Mandarin at the dinner table. I nodded. I was used to being invisible in rooms he owned. The ballroom gleamed with intent. Red and gold banners lined the ceiling, blending the symbols of 2 powerful militaries under one too bright chandelier. Everyone looked important. Everyone had a role, except me. I was standing at the far end of the room near a service station, wearing dress blues and a thin smile, when the Chinese delegation entered. Cameras clicked. Everyone rose. And then, there he was. General Liu Jianhai, a name that didn't often show up in public. Tactician, war historian, former head of Chinese cyber intelligence, and now rumored to be the key voice in a pending Pacific neutrality agreement. He shook hands down the American line, saying little, and then, without ceremony or cue, he stepped behind the lectern at the front of the room. He began to speak, not in Mandarin, not in English, but in a rare southwestern Mandarin dialect I hadn't heard aloud since I was 19. Buried in the mountains of Yunnan province, where I'd once lived among farmers who still boiled their own ink to write. General Liu's voice was calm, deliberate, but the room snapped taut. Murmurs rose. The lead translator, a retired State Department linguist, leaned forward, blinked, then froze. My father leaned toward him. What did he say? Silence. The general kept speaking. I felt it before I realized it. That strange clarity, like standing in the middle of a thunderstorm and knowing exactly where the next bolt will strike. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't change. I simply stepped forward, out of the corner. My father saw me. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. I met his eyes. "I understand him," I said. He scowled. "No one asked you to." General Liu stopped speaking. He turned his head slowly until his eyes landed on me. I bowed my head respectfully, then answered in his dialect. "Honored General, I apologize for the delay. If you permit, I will translate for our hosts." The room fell into the kind of silence that feels like pressure in the lungs. General Liu blinked once, then he nodded, and spoke again, still in dialect. "From this moment forward," he said, never looking at my father, "I will only speak with her." I translated his words aloud. Every person in the room turned to stare at me. My father's face collapsed. He looked like a man who'd just watched his kingdom hand over the crown. My father recovered like the soldier he was, his jaw locked, his eyes narrowed. He gave a clipped nod as if this were merely a change in seating arrangements. But I knew better. For 32 years, I'd watched this man command rooms with a glance, suppress entire discussions with a pause. And tonight, that power didn't answer to him. It answered to me. I stepped to the side of the lectern, the translator retreating in quiet humiliation. I positioned myself 1 step behind General Liu, not beside him, not in front. Just enough to be visible, but not imposing. Just enough to do my job. "General Liu would like to begin with an acknowledgement," I said aloud. "He's aware that this meeting is symbolic, but believes symbols only have power when language does not fail them." There were small nods around the room. The American delegation relaxed slightly, grateful for any momentum. My father stayed still, hands behind his back, eyes forward. But I could feel the heat radiating from his silence. Lou continued speaking, and I translated. His language was formal, but underneath it was a sharpness, a test. His phrasing was old school, filled with references to dynastic proverbs and wartime anecdotes. I matched him word for word, tone for tone. Not just the meaning, the music. At one point, he asked a rhetorical question that made use of a homonym referencing both honor and debt. I rendered it carefully in English, with just enough edge to let the Americans feel the weight. Lou turned his head toward me, just slightly, and gave the smallest nod. Approval or recognition? Maybe both. My father finally spoke again, addressing Lou in English. "We appreciate your candor," he said, "though I hope we can also keep this practical." Lou didn't respond. He glanced at me. "Tell him," he said in dialect. "The practical must still respect the cultural," I translated. The tension in the room shifted. One of the civilian aides chuckled nervously. Someone clinked their glass too loud. And then Lou added one more sentence, quietly, almost to himself. "A daughter trained in silence is often the one who speaks when it matters." I didn't translate that part. I let it hang in the air just for me. That was the moment the tables turned. I wasn't the girl reading poetry under mosquito netting anymore. I wasn't the language hobbyist my father once described to a colleague. I wasn't a background detail in someone else's command structure. I was the bridge. The only person in the room who could make two nations understand each other that night. And it wasn't because I demanded space. It was because when the moment came, I didn't ask for permission. I just stepped forward and spoke. The first time I received a formal commendation, I was 30 years old. It was mid-autumn in Korea, the air sharp and clean outside the Joint Forces Command compound near the DMZ. I was called into the main briefing room and told to stand at attention. Cameras flashed. A few officers clapped politely. The commander read a citation that described my actions as exceptional cross-linguistic interpretation, resulting in the prevention of a multi-layered disinformation breach. In plain terms, I translated something no one else could. A Chinese operative embedded in a North Korean media cell had been intercepting U.S. radio frequencies and inserting subtle distortions, fabricated orders, false troop movements, and impersonated distress calls. The messages weren't in standard Mandarin. They were in a dialect most of our systems flagged as noise, an old variation of Guangxi-accented Cantonese, woven with poetic metaphors and military slang from the 1970s. It took me 6 days, 2 sleepless nights, and a half-rotted notebook from grad school to piece together the pattern. And once I understood it, I recognized it wasn't just static, it was warfare. We traced the transmissions, shut down the node, and scrambled their next wave before it reached our field unit. No one died, no one panicked. The chain of command didn't even flinch, because of a translation. My translation. The medal they pinned to my chest that day was the Meritorious Service Medal. It sat heavy on my uniform, like it didn't quite belong. After the ceremony, I called my father. "Good work," he said after a pause. "You're getting attention." I waited for something more. Instead, he added, "But let's not confuse recognition with readiness. Being good with words doesn't make you a leader, Charlotte. Language wins applause. Leadership wins wars." I remember staring out the window of my barracks, the medal still pinned to my collar. I had risked nothing physically. No bullets, no blood. But I'd stopped something that could have escalated into both. I knew what I did mattered. Still, his words clung to me like condensation on glass, cold, blurry, hard to shake. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, and it wouldn't be the last. When I returned to Hawaii, my CO informed me I was being considered for early promotion to major. My evaluations were strong, my service record clean. But a few weeks later, the paperwork stalled. The reason? Leadership development areas not fully demonstrated in field command, according to my file. An internal notation added that I showed excellent specialization aptitude, but lacked command assertiveness. I knew that phrase. I'd heard my father use it in meetings. Command assertiveness was how he weeded out officers who didn't mirror his posture. Square shoulders, short answers, total control. I was different. I listened too long, spoke too precisely, and when I challenged a conclusion, I did it with citations and context, not volume. That wasn't how he defined strength. And the system still echoed his definition. The promotion list came out. My name wasn't on it. I watched 2 officers, one of whom had once asked me to double-check his translation app, get their gold leaves before I got a second look. I didn't complain. I submitted a request to review my own file. That's when I saw it. A line in the comments field, entered 3 months prior. A single sentence from a senior evaluator whose initials matched my father's. Candidate demonstrates linguistic excellence, but shows limited suitability for battlefield command roles. It didn't say insubordination. It didn't say lack of experience. It said limited suitability, a verdict disguised as feedback, a subtle door closed by someone who claimed to be protecting me from disappointment. I remember sitting in the base library, file still open on the terminal screen, hands folded in my lap. I stared at that sentence for 23 minutes without moving. The room got quieter. The sun shifted across the table. The cursor blinked like a metronome. And I made a decision. I wouldn't challenge it. Not yet. I'd do what he taught me. Observe, analyze, wait. Because words, unlike orders, didn't always explode on impact. Sometimes they buried themselves like seeds. And waited. My brother's name was Caleb. He was 5 years older than me, a natural leader, and everything my father believed a soldier should be. Decisive, physical, fearless. Caleb died in Afghanistan during Operation Mountain Saber in 2007. His unit was ambushed during a reconnaissance mission. He took a bullet to the neck while trying to pull another man from a burning Humvee. He bled out before the medevac arrived. My father never recovered. At the funeral, he stood so still he looked like stone. Not a tear, not a tremble. He saluted the flag as it was folded, whispered something to it under his breath, and handed it to my mother with a nod that broke her in half. From that day forward, everything in his life became about control. He took a promotion to Pacific Command within the year, started handpicking his staff, reviewed field reports personally. He became obsessed with order, hierarchy, performance metrics, anything that might make chaos obey him the next time it showed up on his doorstep. I understood it at first. Grief makes people build walls. But over time, his walls became gates. And those gates only opened for people who looked like Caleb. That never included me. I didn't serve in combat arms. I didn't command ground units. I didn't carry scars on my skin. I studied syntax and subtext. I carried codes, not rifles. And the more proficient I became in my field, the more I felt him pulling away. At first, I thought it was subtle. A missed call after one of my deployments. A short reply to a detailed report I sent him about emerging dialect clusters in Southeast Asia. A compliment diluted by comparison. You're sharp, Charlotte. Different from your brother, but sharp. Different. Always different. I thought maybe I was imagining it, until I saw the files. I'd filed a report 6 months earlier on the growing use of hybrid Mandarin Korean slang in encrypted communications along the 38th parallel. The analysis was critical. It pointed to a joint influence operation designed to confuse signal tracing. I had hard evidence, audio captures, decryption logs, civilian patterns. It should have made it to the Joint Language Operations Review Board. It didn't. I only noticed because I'd referenced it in another report and couldn't find the original in the database. At first, I assumed I'd misfiled it. But when I checked the audit logs, the record showed it had been archived manually. Not for clearance reasons, but for lack of relevance to strategic ops. The archive note was signed off by someone from PACOM with level 5 clearance. That narrowed it down to 5 officers. I cross-checked their review patterns, looking for anomalies. 4 of them had consistent protocols. 1 didn't. My father, he had removed my report from circulation, and it wasn't the first. I spent 3 weeks combing the system during my off hours. I didn't have access to everything, but I had enough reach to track patterns. I found 3 other documents I'd authored, each raising cultural or linguistic flags tied to psychological operations that had been marked as internal only. The common thread? All had been scheduled for interagency briefing reviews. All were pulled just short of submission. All passed through my father's desk. It wasn't accidental, it was deliberate containment. He wasn't just gatekeeping my career. He was shielding the institution from voices like mine, voices that questioned assumptions, that interpreted silence, that didn't shout to be heard. I didn't confront him. Instead, I made copies, backups, metadata, download logs. I began documenting everything, not to build a case yet, but to build clarity. I needed to be sure I wasn't letting resentment drive me into paranoia. And in truth, I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was sobered, like a child realizing the tooth fairy was just her dad with $1 and a flashlight. He had always preached meritocracy. Earn it, he'd say. No one owes you a damn thing in this world. But now I saw the quiet irony of it. The system he worshipped wasn't broken. It was rigged, just subtly enough to feel fair. And for him, keeping Caleb alive meant keeping me small. If I rose too far, if I proved too visible, it threatened the neat order he'd built around his grief. His son, the hero. His daughter, the translator. He couldn't lose Caleb again, so he made sure no one else ever replaced him, especially not me. I sat with that for a long time, weeks. I didn't talk about it to anyone, not my friends, not my supervisor. I let it settle in my bones until it no longer hurt, just sharpened me. Because the day would come, sooner or later, when he would no longer be the one defining the story. And when that day came, I wouldn't raise my voice, I would raise the truth. I lived in Yunnan province for 3 years. The orders came after I completed my graduate coursework, an exchange program between allied military education institutions. Most of my peers chose Western Europe. A few went to Japan. I asked for the Chinese interior, not Beijing, not Shanghai. I wanted the places in between, the ones you don't see in policy briefings. Yunnan wasn't a posting, it was an immersion. I was stationed near Kunming, embedded with civilian language scholars through a joint cultural partnership. My military role was advisory, mostly symbolic. The real mission for me was observation and learning. I didn't learn Mandarin in a classroom. I didn't study it under fluorescent lights from the mouths of professors who had been reading from the same syllabi since the Cold War. I learned it the way a child learns their first language, through proximity, repetition, and silence. I sat with tea vendors at dawn, watching the streets come alive in tones and textures. I helped an old woman sweep the steps outside a Taoist temple for 6 months before she let me see the inscriptions hidden under the altar stones. I spent long weekends translating market signs and handwritten menus, comparing regional characters that no longer appeared in printed texts. And slowly, I began to hear something I'd never heard before. Not just words, but intention. Mandarin isn't a language that rushes. It has pauses that mean more than phrases. The way a speaker exhales between clauses tells you what they've decided. The cadence of a greeting can signal a threat, an invitation, or a dismissal, depending on which province shaped the speaker's jaw. In one village, I spent hours listening to 3 elders argue about politics in a dialect so dense with idioms that even native Mandarin speakers might miss the meaning. But I understood it, because I'd watched how they poured tea before they spoke, who looked down, who laughed with their teeth, who didn't. That's not something they teach at War College. At War College, they teach negotiation structure and strategic posture. They teach conflict modeling and psychological ops. They teach you how to measure the value of a target, not the value of a pause. I remember one afternoon, back at HQ, we were conducting a simulation of bilateral talks with a hostile language component. One of the instructors asked us to identify soft leverage points in the opposing delegation. I raised my hand and said, if we analyze the general's speech cadence, particularly his use of non-standard tonal endings, we can predict when he's masking discomfort. That's when pressure should be applied, not during the formal pivot, but immediately before. There was a long silence, then a snort from the back of the room. A colonel muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, Jesus, sounds like she's reading horoscopes. The room laughed. Even the instructor smirked. That was the echo motif of my career. Language is for support, not for strategy. Interpretation is supplemental, not essential. If you can't shoot it, bomb it, or brief it in bullets, it's fluff. So I smiled, took notes, and filed the humiliation away with the others. I didn't argue. I let them underestimate me. It was easier that way. Because eventually, I'd be in a room where the language would matter more than the rank on anyone's chest. And when that day came, I wouldn't need them to believe me. I'd just need them to listen. 3 days before the diplomatic dinner, I received a message marked classified, limited distribution. It was routed through Joint Language Ops, flagged with an amber-level clearance tag. I read it in my secure inbox, sitting alone in the comms room at Hickam Field, under the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that always made me feel slightly too exposed. The subject line was cryptic: Behavioral Protocol, L. Inside was a short paragraph, written in sanitized military phrasing, but the message was unmistakable. Subject L has a known history of utilizing non-standard dialect as a screening mechanism in strategic engagement environments. Expect use of rare Mandarin variation. Objective appears to be probing of adversary response readiness. Do not initiate translation unless officially prompted. Direct interpretation must be pre-cleared via chain of command. Subject L was General Lu Jianhai. That wasn't a surprise. He was notorious in the inner circles of military linguistics, less for his public operations, and more for the traps he laid for those who underestimated the power of miscommunication. During his tenure in the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, Lu had built a covert information framework that relied on cultural disorientation, deliberate confusion through dialect. He'd once derailed a summit by delivering an entire opening speech in Mindong, a dialect so obscure that the official translator confused reunification with retaliation. That error cost 6 months of negotiation, so when I saw the briefing, I didn't panic. I understood immediately what it meant. Lu was going to test us, and I was ready. What I didn't expect was the second message. An hour later, a follow-up alert pinged through my secure channel, priority override from Pacific Command HQ. The message was only 2 lines. Lieutenant Quinn will attend in an observation-only capacity. No linguistic intervention authorized without explicit direction. Maintain protocol compliance. It was signed off by a 3-star general, my father. Spike Nur 2. I stared at the screen, unmoving. He knew General Lu was coming with a linguistic strategy. He knew no one else in the room would catch it. And still, he wrote that line. Explicit, cold, final. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about chain of command. It was about me. My presence threatened his image, not because I was unqualified, but because if I succeeded publicly, if I solved a problem the rest of his delegation couldn't, it would fracture the story he had built around himself for decades. The story where Caleb was the hero, where Brock Quinn was the mentor, where his daughter was brilliant but quiet, useful but invisible. He would rather the Americans lose face in front of the Chinese than have me be the one who saved it. The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. That was the cost of having a father who never fully saw you. You learn to stop expecting fairness. You learn to treat betrayal as background noise, something you don't flinch at anymore. Just note, absorb, and file away like the rest of your intelligence data. I didn't respond. I didn't push back. Instead, I reviewed the dialect files I'd kept since China. I refreshed my memory on phonetic overlaps in the Southwest Mandarin variants, especially those that mirrored Yunnan inflections, which I suspected Lu would use. I ran drills at night, speaking aloud to myself in the old rhythms, tuning my ear to the cadence most of our devices would miss. If I was going to be silenced, I would be silenced fully prepared. On the morning of the dinner, I pinned my hair back, pressed my uniform to precision, and tucked the briefing memo into my underlayer pocket. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to carry the weight of what had been denied to me. I rode in the third car of the convoy, seated behind 2 senior aides who barely looked in my direction. They were polite but distracted, debating how best to structure our toast in case the general deviated from the planned talking points. One of them joked, "Hopefully he speaks English like last time. No one wants another Cantonese incident." They laughed. I said nothing. Inside, I repeated the same thought over and over in my head like a quiet metronome. You know what he'll say before he says it. You've heard that voice before. It wasn't arrogance. It was memory. I had learned Lu Jianhai's language from his people, not from textbooks, from farmers, from teachers, from aging storytellers who whispered their province's legacy into rice bowls and calligraphy brushes. The language he thought he could use as a wall, I had learned as a bridge, but I stayed silent. I followed orders. until the moment came, until silence became more dangerous than sound. The ballroom shimmered with the kind of overcompensated elegance that only military diplomacy could produce. Glassware that had never seen a dishwasher, centerpieces designed to look accidental, an orchestra tucked into a corner playing Vivaldi as if it were ambient noise. Everything was staged to suggest ease, familiarity, control. But it wasn't subtle, not really. It was the kind of event that screams, "We're winning, but let's pretend it's mutual." And the man at the center of it, projected, polished, and poised, was my father. He wore his full-dress uniform, ribbons laid out like an index of every battle he'd commanded or blessed. He moved from table to table with confident strides, his voice low, warm, and performative. The seating chart had been arranged so that he would flank the Chinese delegation on one side and the Secretary of the Navy on the other. That wasn't chance. That was engineering. He was the architect of this entire evening. I wasn't on the blueprint. I had been instructed to monitor comms flow from the far side of the ballroom. They gave me a table near the exit and a discreet comms earpiece to match my dress blues. I looked like part of the tech support team, present but peripheral. Efficient, quiet, not part of the conversation. That was the idea. From my vantage point, I could see the whole floor. Every plate, every handshake, every micro move of posture. I watched our side lean forward too quickly. I watched theirs hold still a beat too long. The diplomats danced in smiles, but under the music, I heard something else. Tension held by thread and theater. Then the Chinese delegation arrived. General Liu Jianhai entered last, surrounded by his aides. He wasn't tall, but his presence reshaped the air. He didn't smile, he didn't pretend. His eyes scanned the room like a man used to reading classified maps upside down and under pressure. And when his eyes landed on me, they paused. It wasn't long, half a second, maybe less. But I felt it, like a sonar ping hitting something unexpected. He whispered something to the aide on his right, who nodded once, and then looked back at me too. Foreshadowing has a rhythm if you're trained to hear it. And in that moment, I didn't hear threat. I heard calculation. One of the aides passed by my station as they made their way to the main table. He wasn't much older than me, maybe mid-30s, wearing a civilian diplomatic badge. As he passed, he leaned slightly and said in Mandarin, not dialectal but textbook standard. Not everyone forgets the voice of their hometown. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at him. I didn't react. I let my face remain blank. Like I didn't understand, but I did. Every word, every layer beneath the words. What he was really saying was, we know someone here speaks more than they admit, and we're watching to see who steps forward first. He didn't wait for a reply. He kept walking. The message was planted like a test balloon. I logged it mentally but didn't acknowledge it aloud. There was nothing to say, yet. The first course was served. Small talk buzzed. Wine flowed in cautious increments. Our interpreter made jokes with the junior Chinese officers. The mood lightened, but it wasn't real. It was prelude. General Liu barely touched his food. He kept his hands folded, his eyes moving from plate to plate, person to person. Then to the podium, where he would soon speak, and then back to me, again. I glanced down, adjusting my earpiece. Not because it needed it, but because I needed a gesture to break eye contact. I could feel my father watching too, though not from a place of interest, from a place of management. To him, I wasn't part of the orchestra. I was the lighting rig, functional, replaceable, invisible unless something failed. As the main course cleared and dessert approached, a shift began. The music slowed. The orchestration behind the evening leaned toward its centerpiece, remarks from both sides. I saw the cue card pass to the master of ceremonies. I saw my father nod. I saw the interpreter briefed again. It was happening. I pressed the side of my earpiece, activating the silent feed into my left ear. The line was clear, no chatter, just static waiting for sound. I straightened my spine, exhaled once, and waited. Because I already knew what was coming. And so did General Liu. The orchestra stopped first, mid-note, as if a string had snapped. Then came the silence that follows a dropped glass in a cathedral. General Liu Jianhai stood behind the podium. He had declined all introductory remarks, had brushed off the interpreter's offered headset. Instead, he lifted a small hand-folded sheet of paper from his inner jacket pocket and opened it with care, like one might unfold an old prayer. And then he spoke. The language that came out wasn't the polished Mandarin of Beijing. It wasn't even the softened diplomatic version used for peace talks or press conferences. No, this was ancient, raw, Yunnan dialect. A tonal musical rhythm with endings that curved like mountain trails, and consonants dipped in a cadence most linguists would call extinct, a language no one in the room had prepared for. I saw it hit the interpreter like a body blow. He leaned forward, blinking, mouth slightly open, as if the words themselves had physically knocked the breath out of him. He tried once. Then again. The general? Thanks. The dinner? It was barely English. It was guesswork. My father's smile twitched, then flattened. His hand moved toward his comm link. He glanced toward the aide. What is this? I could read the panic in his eyes, even as his voice tried to stay even. The Secretary of the Navy leaned forward. Others looked down at their earpieces, tapping them. Nothing was coming through. And in that void, where meaning evaporates, fear enters. That was when I stood. I didn't ask. I didn't wait for clearance. I stepped out from the shadows by the service doors, unhooked the backup comms mic from my collar, and walked toward the front like I'd always belonged there. My father's voice hissed through my earpiece. Charlotte, don't. But I didn't stop. The sound of my heels on the marble was the only thing louder than the silence. When I reached the foot of the podium, I turned slightly, not to face General Liu, but the audience, and spoke in the same dialect. Clean, clear. Accent shaped by years in rural China, honed in back-alley tea houses and whispered libraries. Honored General, I said in Yunnanese, your words reach us. Let me carry them. The general turned slowly to face me, his expression unchanged. But his eyes sharpened, as if he had just confirmed a theory. He lowered his paper and with a small nod, resumed speaking. This time with just a fraction more speed, like he was done testing. And I, Charlotte Quinn, began to translate. Not word for word, not stiffly, but intuitively, like a musician playing the second half of a duet by ear. I gave them tone, context, pacing. I made the language live. In a world where wires stretch between empires and satellites carry whispers across oceans, he said, it is not the loudest voice that leads, but the one that understands silence. The room was spellbound. Even the servers had paused, standing in the wings like soldiers caught in a sudden ceasefire. I saw the admiral nod just once. I saw the foreign attachés whisper to one another in awe. And I saw my father, his hand still resting on the comms device, his eyes locked on mine, his face unreadable, not anger, not pride, something else, something closer to surrender. For the next 7 minutes, I guided that room through General Liu's intricate symbolic speech, a message about mutual legacy, about old empires learning to listen to new voices, about the discipline it takes to not speak first. It was masterful and dangerous and deliberate, because everyone in that room knew, if his message hadn't been understood, if his words had been lost, it would have been read as an insult, a calculated disruption. But it hadn't been lost, because I was there. And for the first time, I wasn't the daughter of Lieutenant General Brock Quinn. I was the voice of the most unpredictable player in the Pacific Theater. The applause was slow at first. No one wanted to be the first to move. Then came the second wave, from the diplomatic corps. Then a swell of nods, claps, murmurs. But I didn't look to the crowd. I looked to the man behind the podium. General Liu stepped down, passing within inches of me. In English, soft, precise, he said, "They trained you to be invisible. Good. That means no one saw you coming." Then he walked away, and I stood in the space he left behind, microphone still in hand, heartbeat calm. Somewhere behind me, my father sat still, powerless, silent, exactly where he had once told me to stand. The next morning, everything felt quieter, but only on the surface. I walked into the command center with the same badge, same uniform, same bun pulled tight against the back of my neck. No ribbon added, no new rank stitched onto my chest. But the way people looked at me had changed. They didn't look through me anymore. They noticed. Some tilted their heads slightly in recognition, like they were still deciding whether what I had done had been brilliance or disobedience, or both. Others nodded, quickly, respectfully, like I had passed an unspoken test. There were new names in my inbox. An Australian Rear Admiral had invited me to consult for a Pacific Rim strategy review. A colonel from the Korean delegation forwarded a clipped thank you note, praising the elegant diffusion of a potential diplomatic rupture. And then there was the email that made me pause, a message from a senior Japanese advisor I had spoken to just twice in passing. It was short. Ms. Quinn, your fluency is not only in language, it's in listening. You remind us that real diplomacy comes from knowing what is not said. Thank you, for all of us. That one stayed with me. Because in a world where so much depended on what was declared, announced, documented, it was rare for anyone to notice the value of restraint. And yet, while the rest of the world was leaning forward, watching me more carefully, inviting me in with polite curiosity or cautious admiration, he didn't look at me at all. My father, General Brock Quinn. He sat across the table from me in a closed debriefing that afternoon. The room was beige, cold, soundproof. 3 senior officers were present. Everyone spoke in crisp, strategic tones about protocol and perception and contingency framing. No one said mistake. No one said mutiny. The official report would show that I stepped in at the request of senior interpreters when an unanticipated dialect required urgent decoding. That was the compromise. My reputation would be protected, but so would his. When the meeting ended, people filed out quickly. I stood, slower, collected my folder. He stood too, but didn't move. We were the last 2 left, and still he didn't speak. Instead, he looked at me, really looked. His eyes scanned my face like he was searching for something that had gone missing. A code he'd written once and forgotten how to break. There was no fury, no accusation. What I saw there was more haunting. It was fear. Not the kind that came from national threat or military collapse, but the quieter, more personal kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've been outrun by your own blood. That I was no longer under his shadow, I was beyond it. And that was what terrified him. It wasn't the speech. It wasn't that I spoke up. It was that the world listened. And maybe that I never asked his permission. I didn't say anything. I didn't explain myself or apologize. I just met his stare and held it, calmly, like I had nothing to prove anymore. Because I didn't. I walked past him, the scent of his old aftershave, sharp, menthol, unyielding, still lingering in the air. And in that moment, I thought back to a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was 10. We were in his study, and he was polishing a saber mounted on the wall. I asked him why he never let me touch it. He said, because power isn't something you hand to someone. It's something they earn. And once they have it, no one can take it back. At the time, I thought he was talking about his rank. Now I knew. He had been talking about control. And that night, at the diplomatic dinner, I had taken it from him without force, without demand, just by being who I was meant to be, without waiting for his nod. That scared him more than any enemy ever could. In the days that followed, I kept to my duties. Quiet, efficient, unshaken. I answered every request, prepared for every scenario, submitted every report with flawless precision. But underneath that, I began to gather names, dates, paper trails. It had started before the dinner, but now I had momentum. I knew where to look, and I had finally stopped hoping he'd be proud of me, because somewhere deep inside, I understood. He hadn't wanted a daughter. He had wanted a legacy, and I wasn't the shape he thought it should take, but I wasn't going to disappear just to make him more comfortable. That era was over. The official summary of the diplomatic dinner was released 2 days later, a clean 7-page PDF. Headers in bold, statements quoted, diplomatic gestures highlighted, strategic implications softened with vague, polished language. It read like every other declassified memo crafted for public perception and bureaucratic record. But when I skimmed the distribution list and glanced through the contributor section, something caught me. My name wasn't there, not as a translator, not as an advisor, not as an attendee, nowhere. I refreshed the portal, checked the metadata, downloaded a second version in case the first had been cached wrong. Still nothing. I checked the draft log, cross-referenced the clearance trail. It was subtle, but not accidental. Every other officer who had spoken during that night, even briefly, had been listed. Even the catering liaison was mentioned by title, but the voice that translated the most high-stakes foreign address of the evening, mine, was conspicuously absent. I clicked through to the approval log. It showed 4 digital signatures authorizing the final release. The last one? Lieutenant General Brock Quinn, my father. Of course it was. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled once, not with rage, not even disappointment. That had passed. What settled over me now was a kind of clinical clarity. This wasn't about shame or oversight. It was a move, a message. He didn't yell. He didn't confront me in private. No passive-aggressive comments in the hallway or correctional memos. Instead, he did what he always did. He erased. He had always believed power meant controlling the narrative. And this time, the narrative that threatened his image the most was me. I didn't react. Not visibly. But something shifted inside me, finally, fully. I opened my locked drawer, pulled out the slim navy blue folder I had started weeks ago. It was marked only with a small sticker. Q class. A joke at first, but not anymore. Inside were records, digital timestamps, copies of past evaluation reports, screenshots of approved recommendations for promotion, ones that had inexplicably been rescinded before processing. I had long suspected my file had been tampered with over the years. My performance scores never aligned with the delays in advancement. My colleagues used to joke about bureaucratic black holes. But now I had names, logs, gaps. And now I had motive. I didn't go public. I didn't storm into his office. I didn't even raise it with the board. That would have given him the reaction he expected. Something emotional. Something that proved his theory that I was too impulsive, too sensitive, too unsuited for command. No. I made an appointment. Not with him, with legal. I met with a military attorney, Captain Dana Flores, JAG Corps. She was sharp, calm, with a mind that filed details as efficiently as any intelligence server. I laid everything on the table: the disappearing report, the unsigned promotion trails, the mismatched records, the chain of command breaches that quietly circumvented proper acknowledgement of my work, and the fact that in every instance, one name appeared in the authorization log before the files changed course: my father's. Captain Flores listened, didn't interrupt. She asked for access to the portals I mentioned. I had already created a secure dossier with passwords, dates, and side-by-side comparisons. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "This isn't career sabotage. It's institutional abuse of authority. You understand what you're walking into." I nodded. "I'm not trying to bring him down," I told her, "but I'm done being erased." She asked one more time if I was sure. I was. Because what he did wasn't just silence, it was rewriting truth. He'd counted on the fact that I wouldn't push back, that I'd rather preserve family dignity than expose unethical conduct, that I wouldn't risk my future just to demand a proper past. And for years, he was right. Until now. The complaint was filed internally, classified under sealed review. I didn't talk about it. I continued my assignments as if nothing had shifted. Attended meetings, submitted reports, stayed late, left early, always meticulous. But in the background, a process had begun. I had placed a mirror in front of the system, not to burn it down, but to show what it had chosen not to see. I wasn't seeking revenge. Not in the way people imagine it, scorched earth, career-ending drama. What I wanted was clarity. What I demanded was correction. Because you can't build integrity on top of a mission. And the legacy he protected at the expense of my own had been built on silence I no longer intended to maintain. He thought I would be too grateful, too loyal, too cautious to ever challenge him. But he had forgotten one thing. I speak many languages, and the one I know best is truth. The morning the internal investigation was formally announced, I was already at my desk. The announcement came not through a dramatic public reveal, but as a simple encrypted message in my secure inbox. Subject: Article 138 Proceedings Initiated. Attached was a notification of inquiry under Uniform Code of Military Justice Guidelines. It was brief, clinical, but behind those words, I knew a tremor had begun. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't alert the press. I didn't post cryptic messages or quote justice on social media. I let my work speak where my voice had once been buried. Let the paper trail, the one he thought I'd never gather, carry the weight. The investigators didn't come to me with praise. They came with protocols, background checks, timeline confirmations, interviews conducted behind closed doors, guarded by discretion. I wasn't asked to testify, not yet. I was listed only as the initial complainant, a source, not a daughter, not a victim, not a rebel, just the first in line. By the end of the second week, 2 more reports had been filed. The third came from a woman I barely knew, Major Eliza Tran. She worked in defense attaché. Our paths had crossed once in a strategy simulation, years ago. I remembered she was brilliant, precise, and visibly tired every time we spoke. I never knew why. Until she filed. Her memo cited repeated obstructions in her clearance process, unexplained delays in security reauthorization, and advisory flags placed on her profile that stemmed, as it turned out, from the same command office, Quinn. My father. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. She left a note inside her submission, which eventually found its way to me through a quiet channel. You stood up first, so now I'm not standing alone. It hit me harder than any reprimand I'd ever received. 1 became 3, 3 became 7. Some were buried records from a decade ago, quiet resignations, unexplained retirements, women transferred out of key positions right before promotion reviews. They all traced back to a pattern, not always signed, but always influenced. A climate of slow erasure. I was not the only one who'd been silenced. Somewhere in the middle of week 4, I passed a younger lieutenant in the corridor of the Joint Intel Center. She looked at me with something more than acknowledgement. A pause. A flicker of recognition not based on rank, but resonance. She hesitated. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "They used to say women like you made it harder for the rest of us. Now I realize women like you made it possible." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded once and kept walking. I kept my silence, but not out of fear this time. I was watching something else emerge, a language that had always been spoken in the halls, suppressed, redirected, ignored, now being heard. Not because it was loud, because it was consistent. I reviewed my documents each night, redacted nothing. I added a few more timelines I had forgotten. I submitted them without commentary. I wasn't seeking vengeance. I wasn't trying to destroy his legacy. I was uncovering the invisible system beneath his protection, a structure built on fear, loyalty, and the assumption that no one would ever question a decorated general, especially not his daughter. But they were questioning him now, and they weren't doing it because I shouted. They were doing it because I whispered with proof. A retired colonel, female, submitted a statement. Her record showed she'd been recommended for brigadier general in 2013. The recommendation was quietly withdrawn. She never knew why. It was my documentation that helped her realize what had happened. She had served with my father. She ended her report with this line: "The cost of silence is trust. The cost of truth is grief. I choose the latter." By week 6, the Army had convened a special review panel. It wasn't front-page news, but in military circles, it was an earthquake. The words command influence, gender bias, and unofficial performance suppression became threads in legal memos and whispered sidebars. My father hadn't stepped down. Not yet. But his presence had become a shadow, looming and shrinking at once. Some officers still saluted him, but fewer spoke with ease. And me? I became the one they looked at differently, not with sympathy or discomfort anymore, but with something that looked a lot like respect. I didn't need applause. I didn't want vindication in the form of ceremony. What I wanted was movement, and it was happening, quietly, powerfully. One file at a time. Because truth doesn't always knock down doors. Sometimes it sits across the table, opens a folder, and dares the room to pretend it doesn't exist. It wasn't leaked, it was submitted, deliberately, through a secured channel. A single audio file, time-stamped 3 years ago. The envelope was marked, Supplemental Evidence, Ethics Review Panel. I didn't recognize the sender's name, but I recognized the clearance level, high, quiet, surgical. The file was only 12 minutes long, but only one sentence mattered. The moment I heard it, I knew what it was. I knew the cadence of that voice too well. My father's voice. He sounded calm, collected. Not angry, not cruel, just resolved. That made it worse. He was speaking to someone, a colleague, maybe another general. The context was buried in policy talk, evaluations, and future planning. And then, she's good, I'll admit that. But I can't let her stand above me, not my own daughter. Just like that. No accusation, no attack, no scandalous reveal. Just truth. Naked, unfiltered, and small enough to fit in one breath. When the ethics panel played it during closed-door proceedings, I wasn't in the room. But I heard from someone who was, a colonel. She messaged me 3 hours later. It went quiet, like a room holding its breath. I've never seen a general drop his pen before. They asked my father if it was authentic. He didn't deny it. He didn't excuse it. He only said, yes. No follow-up. No elaboration. That was his explanation. He submitted his retirement request the same day. No public statement, no final salute, no press coverage. No tightly folded flag handed to a wife who once knew what ambition looked like in a man's eyes. He walked out the side door of power, alone. There was no ceremony, no marble backdrop with stars aligned behind him. No junior officers choking back tears in gratitude. No legacy speech. Just a resignation. Effective immediately. He didn't return to his quarters on base. His belongings were packed and delivered within 48 hours. No one touched his nameplate. It came down the minute his resignation was processed. There were whispers. Of course there were. Some said he was protecting me by resigning. Some said he'd finally been cornered. Some just said nothing. Because what can you say when the man who shaped policy for 20 years leaves without so much as a handshake? I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt still. Like the moment after an earthquake, when the dust hasn't settled, but the shaking's stopped. Later that week, I passed the conference room where the panel had convened. The door was cracked open. Inside, a junior clerk was stacking folders. She looked up and paused when she saw me. Then she stood. And for the first time since this began, someone saluted me, not because of rank, because of recognition. Not long after, I received an invitation to submit a formal policy proposal. A panel was forming to study the long-term effects of familial command influence and suppressed advancement pathways. I wrote it in one night. I didn't make it personal. I didn't use my father's name. I used data, dates, documentation, testimony from others who came forward. But in the footnotes, I included the transcript of the recording. I typed it out myself. Each word, carefully, without editing, without interpretation. She's good, but I can't let her stand above me. That sentence had shaped my entire career. Now it would shape something else: policy, change, consequences. I didn't attend his retirement paperwork briefing. I wasn't invited, and I wouldn't have gone. But I heard he signed everything in silence. No eye contact. No final remarks. Just initials, just pen on paper. It was how he built his career, on signatures and silence. It was fitting, in a way, that silence would end it too. Later that night, I found an old photo buried in my files. Me, age 8, standing beside him in full uniform. I was holding his hat, grinning. He wasn't smiling. He was looking away, already, even back then. I kept the photo, but I tucked it away behind something else. My own certificate of commission, dated and signed. The document he'd once tried to block. There's a strange grief that comes with surviving your father's legacy. It doesn't announce itself like mourning. It's quieter. Like the way a room feels colder after someone walks out, even if the heat is still on. But I didn't collapse. I stepped forward. Because he may have left without a flag, but I was still here. And I was finally free to speak. 3 weeks passed. I was in my quarters, halfway through reviewing a new set of regional dialect threat assessments, when the envelope arrived. No insignia. No forwarding label. Just my name. Handwritten in a script I hadn't seen in years. His handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I care to admit. My fingers hovered over the seal like the paper might burn. It didn't feel like an ambush, it felt like a breath. One last breath, folded into paper and sent from silence. Inside was a single page, thick stock, slightly uneven edges, no return address, no preamble. He had written it in pen. Charlotte, I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't expect it. I won't try to explain what I did. This is not a justification, it's just the truth, or at least what's left of it. I stopped reading. Let the words settle like ash, then continued. When your brother died, a part of me calcified. I stopped seeing possibility and started seeing risk. You were brilliant, too brilliant, and that terrified me. You were not supposed to carry the burden. I thought, if I kept you in the background, you'd be safe. I mistook shadowing for protection. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was an admission, raw and unshielded. He didn't dress his words in military precision. He wrote like a man fumbling in the dark. I didn't know how to love you in the way you needed. I thought love was legacy, rank, discipline. You needed something else, and I didn't give it to you. That line broke something open in me, quietly, without drama. My throat burned, not from anger, but from recognition. From the ache of someone finally seeing you after years of turning away. He continued. Every time you spoke a language I didn't understand, I felt myself shrink. Not because I doubted you, but because I knew you were going places I had no map for. I sat down on the edge of my bunk, folded the letter in half, then opened it again. Because some words aren't meant to be read just once. Some truths deserve the sound of paper creasing beneath your fingers. I didn't know how to raise a daughter who could outpace me. That was never modeled for me. But that doesn't mean you didn't earn everything. You did. You do. There was no signature, just a line at the bottom. Keep going farther, that was all. He didn't ask for a call, didn't invite a conversation. There was no hint of reconciliation, no plea for redemption. But in that final paragraph, there was something more valuable to me than forgiveness or regret. There was acknowledgement, not in front of an audience, not in a tribunal, but in the space between a father and his daughter. He saw me, not as a reflection of his failures, not as a mistake to be managed, but as a person, whole, independent. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need him to stand behind me, or beside me, or even believe in me. I just needed him to stop denying what I had become. And now, in ink that trembled slightly with age, he had. I placed the letter in my drawer, not to bury it, but to keep it, as a record, not of closure, but of change. I didn't cry right away, but that night, when the bass was quiet, when the wind outside pressed gently against the windows and the world forgot to roar, I sat in my chair and let the tears fall. Not because I was sad, but because something heavy had been lifted, not erased, just named. And that was enough. 2 months after the letter, I received my appointment, Deputy Director of the Strategic Language and Cultural Intelligence Program. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. I just stared at the official orders in my inbox, the black text looking back at me like an echo of every quiet moment I'd endured. It didn't feel like revenge. It didn't even feel like vindication. It felt like alignment, like something that should have always been mine, finally catching up to where I had already walked. The office was on the top floor of a quiet building inside Fort Belvoir, with tall windows that overlooked the Potomac and pale wooden floors that muffled footsteps. There was a long conference room that had not been used properly in years, just static presentations and coffee-fueled briefings with no resonance. That became my classroom. I started small, just 12 officers from various branches, handpicked not for rank or resume, but for curiosity. I told them we wouldn't be memorizing phrases or simulating hostage negotiations. We're not here to speak over, I said in the first session. We're here to learn how to listen under. They looked puzzled. I smiled. Language is not just communication. It's camouflage. It's code. It's confession. But only if you listen with more than your ears. We began with listening drills, real ones. I gave them field audio with multiple dialects layered in. I asked them to not just identify the words, but to note pauses, intonations, hesitations. I asked, where does the speaker feel vulnerable? Where do they slip into the familiar? I asked them to notice when someone switched dialects, not out of comfort, but out of tactic. Some resisted at first. One Marine captain raised his hand during week 2 and said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think knowing a tone drop in Vietnamese gets us closer to winning." I nodded. Then I played him an intercepted call from a border checkpoint. 2 speakers, seemingly calm, but one shift in dialect mid-sentence suggested knowledge of a third party nearby. We had traced that call 2 hours later to a hidden weapons drop. The tone shift had been the warning. The room went silent. I didn't smile. I just said, "Words are weapons, but only if you can hear how they're being unsheathed." I began hanging maps in the room, big wall-length linguistic maps. One showed the Indo-Tibetan phonetic chain. One showed the tonal transition zones across West Africa. Another detailed the vowel shifts across southern Russia. But the one I saved for last was a detailed dialect grid of China. Dozens of red pins marked the provinces: Mandarin, Cantonese, Wu, Xiang, Hakka, Gan, Jin. And there, on the far left corner of the map, was a cluster of faded terrain. Yunnan. I pinned it in silence. That map went into the main strategy room, not because it looked impressive, but because I wanted every visiting official, every general, every contractor to walk in and see that what once was dismissed as minor dialectology now sat at the center of U.S. strategy briefings. One afternoon, I stood in front of my class as they studied a new series of field videos. A young lieutenant leaned forward and whispered to another, "It's like decoding a human being." That's when I told them a story I had never shared aloud. I was once told to stand in the corner of a peace talk room. Just stay quiet. Be invisible. No one said it out loud, but I was placed where I couldn't rise. I paused. But here's the thing about corners. They waited. From a corner, if you're quiet and patient, you can see the whole damn room, the power, the cracks, the way truth sneaks in sideways. No one spoke. No one had to. We ended that day with a field exercise in silence. No one was allowed to speak for 30 minutes while they observed live diplomatic footage. They came back changed, and I watched them, not as a commander, not even as an instructor, but as someone who had built a bridge between languages, between silence and strategy, between what I had been denied and what I could now give. The corner I'd once been pushed into. It had become my vantage point, and Yunnan, once dismissed as a distant province, now hung quietly above the main briefing screen, framed and backlit. A single red pin marked the village where I first heard the tones no textbook could teach. Every time I looked at it, I remembered. Not every battlefield has sand and smoke. Some have tables and dialects. And some victories come not with medals, but with the soft acknowledgement that the map, finally, leads through your language. My name is Charlotte Quinn, and I have never raised my voice in a command room. Not once. Not because I lacked conviction, but because I was taught early that the loudest person is rarely the one being heard. My strength didn't come from breaking the table. It came from learning who built it, and how to speak in a language they couldn't ignore. People often ask me if I still think about my father. The answer is, of course I do. He was never a villain. He was a man of his generation, hardwired to believe strength meant control, not comprehension. He feared what he couldn't guide. He mistook my autonomy for threat. But I do not hate him. He was a soldier. And like many soldiers, he believed in the chain of command more than the chain of trust. I understand that now. Still, understanding does not excuse silence. If I had waited for someone else to see me, to promote me, to speak up for me, I would still be standing at the edge of that negotiation table, headset in hand, watching men tell each other stories they didn't understand. No one was coming. Not for me. Not for the other women whose reports disappeared. Not for the officers who spoke rare languages that never made it to briefing decks. Not for the quiet ones who could read the air better than they could raise their voice. So I stood up, not with anger, with fluency, with preparedness, with patience. I stood in a dialect no one expected. I let my words shape the room. I let my training and my history do what rank had not yet done, make them see. Now, when I walk into a room, there is no introduction needed. People turn, people listen, not because I'm someone's daughter, but because they know I'll say the one thing they've overlooked, in the one language they forgot to study. I became the voice I once needed, and I carry that with me for others who are still standing silent at the edge of rooms, waiting to be asked. Let me say this to them now. You do not have to yell. You do not have to perform. But you do have to speak, when it matters, in the way only you can. It might be in a briefing room. It might be in a courtroom. It might be at the dinner table, surrounded by people who still don't know your worth. Speak anyway, even if your voice shakes. Even if your father signs the orders that erase your name. Even if the room doesn't stop when you enter. Speak. Because somewhere down the line, someone will hear it. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. And that might be all they need to finally step forward too. I am not the daughter he wanted, but I am the officer I was meant to become. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not for applause, but because some of us were born to speak softly, and still change the course of a room. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Because this part, the final part, isn't really about me anymore. It's for the ones still standing in the corner. To those who've been passed over, who've been asked to wait their turn, who've been told they're too quiet, too different, too much of something, or not enough of everything, this is for you. I want you to know this. If you carry something rare, something true, something the room doesn't yet recognize as valuable, don't wait for permission to step into the light. Don't wait for a stage. Don't wait for a nod or a hand reaching back. Sometimes no one is coming to call you forward. You'll have to rise on your own. And when you do, it won't be dramatic. No fireworks, no music swelling. It will be one sentence said clearly, one report written with care, one moment when everyone else hesitates, and you don't. That's when the room will shift. Not because you shouted, but because the truth you've carried quietly has become too real to ignore. I carried mine for years, my language, my instincts, my perspective, through briefings where I wasn't listed, decisions where I wasn't asked. But I carried them anyway, and when the moment came, I did not raise my voice. I raised my standard. I stepped out, no longer as someone's daughter, but as someone who had walked through fire and chosen not to let it consume her voice. This morning, I walked out of the military headquarters for the last time in full uniform. The sun hit the emblem on my shoulder just right. It caught the edge of the strategic language pin, the one they now give to cadets in the listening initiative I helped build. And no one told me to wait in the corner, not anymore, because sometimes the corner gives you the clearest view of the room. So to anyone still waiting on the sidelines, don't wait for the applause. Don't wait for the invitation. Walk forward with what you know. Say what only you can say. And if your voice shakes, let it. If your hands tremble, raise them anyway. Because courage doesn't always feel like power. Sometimes it feels like finally refusing to be edited out. Sometimes it's just the act of being fully, undeniably present. So I'll leave you with this. If you know you carry something precious, don't wait for the room to change. Be the reason it does. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.